Plato. He says regarding Atlantis, every word of this story is true. As strange as this sounds, it's quite odd to begin a quote unquote myth with the disclaimer to the reader that actually this is a bizarre story.
It wasn't Plato who invented the story of Atlantis, but Plato in his two dialogues says that it was Solon.
He says the story was brought down to him from a distant relative, from the first Athenian lawgiver Solon, which brings us to around roughly 9,600 BC.
I actually think that date is accurately translated. And I think it's an incredibly important date because that's basically the end of the Ice Age.
Anatomically, modern humans existed for about 200,000 to even 400,000 years. A date of 12,000 years ago isn't that much long ago, and I think it is still within the time frames that such a civilization could have existed.
And he even says, to contradistinguish the Mediterranean from the Atlantic, he says our sea is but like an inland sea. It's like a lake. It's like a large lake. And then beyond the Straits of Gibraltar, the true ocean can be reached, wherein lies Atlantis, and beyond it, a continent that surrounds the true sea. How did a Greek philosopher living in Athens in 360 BC know about North America?
Hello and welcome everyone, my name is Aleksander and today we are starting a new channel with historian and author Michael Leflem, and in the first few episodes we'll focus on the lost history of humanity and especially the topic of Atlantis. Hello Michael, how are you doing and what are we talking about in this episode?
Hi Alex, thank you so much for having me back. Today I'd like to introduce listeners to the topic. Maybe you're not familiar with some of the details. Maybe you've heard Atlantis from just being on Earth. It's a common theme. And here to kind of untangle a lot of the misconceptions and bring a little bit of historical reality back to, I think, a wildly misunderstood and misrepresented topic that deserves a more serious look.
Exactly. That's actually the main idea behind our channel, to show that such topics like Atlantis or other things that may not be conventional can be approached from both a conventional way and an open mind to find the ultimate truth. And for everyone who doesn't know us, we are both authors. Michael is additionally a historian, but we are both authors. Michael is author of Visions of Atlantis, and I'm an author of Déjà, Has Everything Already Been, and our books are both focused on the lost history, lost civilizations and stuff like that. And in this and in many other episodes, we'll try to slowly build up the information, the database concerning the biggest mysteries from our most distant epochs and from the most distant epochs that humanity has remembered. And I think that the first thing we should do, we should start with the idea of Atlantis, as you mentioned. What is Atlantis? What are the sources about Atlantis? And what exactly it is?
Yes, well, that's quite a question, Alex. Well, I think when I was trying to convey such a difficult topic, and really a topic that was so strewn all over the place, from the New Age to, classical antiquity in the person of, say, Plato with his, famous account of Atlantis and its infamous decline and fall in his two dialogues, Critias and Timaeus, which were written around 360 BC. What I wanted to do in my book and on this channel is kind of systematically analyze, as I did in the book, all the evidence and try to figure out, what is fact, what is fiction, and also why is this story important to us today? And so I think going back to the antiquity, the two most famous accounts really come from Plato, who is a totally credible source, I think. I don't think anybody would doubt that. And yet, for some reason, with his account of Atlantis, many people take issue and say, well, this is a foundational myth, which I always caution people, because not just of the overwhelming correlations between his account and later information that he had no knowledge of, say geological, archaeological, and later, as we'll get into, some of the remote viewing evidence. But if you just stick with what Plato said, I think it's quite fascinating and quite revelatory, and also quite statistically impossible that he would have said what he said if he was creating a quote-unquote foundational myth. And I should also add, a lot of these beliefs are later superimposed on what he said. I look at what he said to the best of my ability, and just to start off there, as I mentioned in my book, in the character of Socrates, who's really Plato speaking through the dialogue, as he's describing to Critias in the eponymous dialogue, he says regarding Atlantis, every word of this story is true, as strange as this sounds. And so I think it's quite odd to begin a quote unquote myth with the disclaimer to the reader that actually this is a bizarre story, but it's true. And so that's the first thing, point of departure that I take with people that just say this is all fictional. Now, what does he say in regards to, say, a date of this event? Well, he says the story was brought down to him from a distant relative, from the first Athenian lawgiver, Solon, who lived in the mid, let's say, 7th century BC, somewhere around there. And that gives us a date, let's say, roughly of 620, 630 BC. Let's just use that date, 650 BC, just to round it out. It's not exactly clear when Solon was born and died to the best of our ability, but let's just say for the purpose of this discussion, Solon lived around 650 BC. Well, Plato says Atlantis was destroyed 9,000 years before the time of Solon, which brings us to around roughly 9,600 BC, or
9,650 BC. Now, many people, because that date seems extreme, have bent over backwards and bent themselves into a pretzel to try to rationalize, well, that's not really what he meant. Well, he added a zero. Well, that was mistranslated because the Greeks weren't using years the same way. I found no evidence for that. I actually think that date is accurately translated. And I think it's an incredibly important date because, unbeknownst to Plato, but known to us, that's basically within plus or minus a few hundred years, depending on which geologist you ask, the end, officially, of the Ice Age. And we now know, almost I would say beyond a shadow of a doubt, that the Ice Age did end cataclysmically over a period of hundreds of years, and likely due to comet fragment impacts, as Graham Hancock, Randall Carlson, many others have noted. So I would say right there, if we were just looking at this objectively, regardless of what the civilization looked like, its exact timeline, but if we're just taking that as a point of departure, we have an incredibly credible source in the, I would argue, progenitor of Western philosophy, giving a very specific date that aligns almost directly with modern geological evidence for a cataclysmic ending to a human epoch. So I would say right there, just as my opener, that's an incredibly strong start before we get into any of the more esoteric stuff or any of the pre-Platonic sources who mentioned him, which we'll talk about on other episodes, or any of the latter cross-cultural, let's say, references or similarities or inexplicable things that Atlantis would explain. We just take the foundation from, say, Plato. That's an incredibly important correlation, I think, the end of the Younger Dryas and this 9,600 BC date that Plato claims Solon was told by the temple priests at sites.
Yes, exactly. I totally agree. So let's sum up the story of Atlantis and the topic of Atlantis to all the people who may have heard of it, but maybe are just laymen and do not know much about it. So
Sure.
Atlantis is some kind of a previous civilization that existed 9,000 years before Solon, and it was a civilization on an island. And this island looked like, according to Timaeus and Critias, which are the two dialogues in which Plato describes Atlantis, and interestingly, these are the latest of his dialogue, and Critias ends abruptly with the finishing, the
Right.
ending, the catastrophe of Atlantis, which occurred during a single night and day. So cataclysmically, it sunk during a single night and day. And this Atlantis civilization was like an island, and in the middle of it was a hill with the temple of Poseidon, and then there were concentric rings of water and land. And this is how it all looked like. And another key thing is that Atlantis was a very mountainous area. So it was a mountainous island, and on this island there was a civilization that sank long ago, about 9,000 years before Solon. And now, giving a geological and the history of Earth context, during our past we had plenty of different ice ages, the last of which ended exactly during the time of the destruction of Atlantis, between, let's say, 13,000 years ago to 11,000 years ago. So again, similar dates, and in geology it isn't that we measure the exact year or even a century or a decade, but in geology processes take long periods of time, sometimes even millions of years. So in geology it isn't all that stiff that in this year this happened, in this year this happened. No, it is the other way. So we know that about this millennium this was happening on Earth, and in the next million this was happening. And we know that when the Ice Age was ending, of course, as the name suggests, the Ice Age, which occurred on the entire Earth and which resulted in having lots of ice caps all over the world, which covered most of north of Europe, north of America. So during the ending of the last ice age, as the name suggests, those ice caps were melting, and finally they melt to the present state that we know that there are only ice caps on the northernmost and southernmost part. So this is how the geology works. And as you mentioned, that plenty of skeptics say that this is a very remote age, and of course we look at 9,600 years before current era, so about 11,600 years ago, and we know that first civilization started about 3,000 to 4,000 years before current era, so about, let's say, 5,000 to 6,000 years ago. So we are talking about the actual prehistory of humanity, because history started with the first writing, with the first civilizations. But still, I was very interested about this date, and is it possible that some kind of civilization existed in those, let's say, a bit remote era? And when I found out genetically that modern humans, anatomically modern humans, existed for about 200,000 to even 400,000 years,
Right.
a date of 12,000 years ago isn't that much long ago, and I think it is
Absolutely.
still within the time frames that such a civilization could have existed. So I do not understand such skepticism that, oh, it is impossible because it is such a remote era. And one last thing to give our viewers a geological and historical context, we know that about the same time as the last ice age was ending, we have an event called Neolithic Revolution. So at that time, because the climate was changing, if the last ice age was ending, the climate was much more abundant for people and it was easier for people to live. If everything was more abundant, people could actually start a sedentary lifestyle from those cavemen that we know from, all the media, that, they were so primitive and they were living from a meal to meal. We know that is to some extent a fact because of the Ice Age. And I think that I was always perplexed by the fact that this date provided by Plato for the destruction, which was actual sinking of the Atlantis, coincides with the end of the last Ice Age, which goes to both the facts that at that time people started sedentary lifestyle from the primitive hunter-gatherer one, and also the ice caps were melting, so maybe that melting led to the sinking of Atlantis, who knows?
Right. And you mentioned a lot of things that I think are really important. Let's start with the first is, look, anatomically modern, meaning we don't know exactly what their, say, physiognomy would look like in terms of, say, the facial features or, texture of their hair or shape of their nose. But anatomically, there have been people as you mentioned, up to, I've seen the same number, 350,000, 400,000 BC, placing Homo sapiens sapiens, that emergent state. So when you're talking about nearly 500,000 years, human beings with the same or potentially larger brain capacity as ourselves have been on planet Earth, the idea that they were doing nothing, for, say, if we take, let's just say 300,000 years, if we say, okay, so for the first 296,000 years, they didn't do a single thing. And then suddenly there was an explosion of, civilization. It took 296,000 years to reach that point of basic, as you said, Neolithic revolution. I think that's just as ridiculous as saying there is nothing beyond, let's say, Sumeria or the Fertile Crescent, or, going back to some of the Harappan civilization in India. That idea itself, I think, and I don't think that's an idea that's commonly known. I think so many of these anthropological dates are just simply, I think, skipped over in school, or the average person is, even if they're not religious, they're still thinking in that kind of young earth creationist type time span when it comes to Homo sapiens for some reason. So I think that's incredibly important, and I know you touch on that in your book, and I do as well. The other thing is, untangling this idea of, I would say, the kind of Disney cartoon version of the island of Atlantis, the lost island that sank in a night and a day. Yes, Plato did use that expression, but I would also caution people, it's very easy to think, when you think of an island, what's the first thing people think of? They think of a small island. They think of, the Hawaiian Islands or the Bahamas or, some Bermuda or something like this. But if you actually look at what Plato says, where he places this island, and later on the geology of the Mid-Atlantic Ridge, which I would argue is the location of the final iteration of Atlantis, we're talking about a quite large island, not as large as, say, Australia or anything like that, but I would say roughly the size of, say, Spain without Portugal, which is an enormous island compared to, say, I think what most people think. And if you also think about the backstory, much of this backstory comes from other sources, and later on clairvoyant accounts from, say, Edgar Cayce and Frederick Oliver add an incredible backstory that really, I think, was the key to my research in filling in the gaps of Plato. But if you just take what Plato says about, say, the backstory of Atlantis, he doesn't say it was just an island. He says it was an empire that had dominion all the way through the Straits of Gibraltar up to Egypt. Okay, so that's important, and that's very much forgotten in this story. Even when people cite Plato, they don't read the whole dialogue where he says this was a maritime thalassocracy. This is a maritime empire that had dominion
throughout the Mediterranean, including colonies in North Africa, up to Egypt, south of Spain. And you see traces in names of, I would argue, Atlantean names. For example, the cities of Cadiz, Spain. It's one of the oldest cities in Europe. I think it is the oldest city, the Phoenician colony. Many people would argue the Phoenicians themselves were descendants of this ancient civilization. And what was it originally called? Gadir. And before that, Goddess. And Goddess was one of the Atlantean 12 kings that Plato mentioned. So it's not just this kind of isolated kind of Disney, there was a super advanced civilization living on a, island the size of, Nassau, Bahamas, where my family's from. You're talking about a semi-continent sized landmass, which, as I discovered through non-Platonic sources, had actually already gone through two cataclysmic destructions, one in 50,000 BC roughly, the other in 22,000 BC, and later the one Plato described around 10,000 BC or 9,600, when the continent had been whittled down to a much smaller archipelago, which he also describes Atlantis as a maritime empire and an archipelago, because the circular city he describes as being on the capital or principal island with the temple of Poseidon, the island that many other sources would call Poseid. And he says this central island had dominion over the other islands. And he even mentions, I would argue, although you can, I think, take a little bit of leeway with which continent he was describing, but he clearly describes either North or South or Central America, because he describes you could reach the whole of the other continent across the true ocean from this island. He says the Atlantic was navigable at that time, or crossable, depending on how you translate that word. So I think these are incredibly important details. As a historian, everything comes down to details. When you're talking about World War II history, or you're talking about the Kennedy assassination, or you're talking about any kind of important controversial subject, you have to look at the details. And I think that's one of the strengths of your work. And it's something I tried to definitely incorporate myself throughout my research is, let's just remove all prejudice and actually look at what these ancient reputable sources were saying and just kind of plot it out and see, does this make any sense? Is there an island or a sunken landmass off, or as he says, directly in front of the Straits of Gibraltar, the Pillars of Hercules? Yes, absolutely. It's called the Mid-Atlantic Ridge. Is there evidence, of the geology that he described Atlantis as having in this location? Yes, absolutely, there is. So I think right there, if there was nothing, if there was no Mid-Atlantic Ridge, say, one of the largest sunken land masses in the world is the Mid-Atlantic Ridge, huge, enormous mountain range that splits the Atlantic Ocean. If that didn't exist, I would say, sure, there's more evidence that it's a myth, but it does exist. It exists exactly where he said it would be. So I always think when people want to be skeptical, I always flip it on them. Well, show me the evidence that would convince me to be skeptical. Because there's a great, I think, theme that I would like to remind listeners is that just because you don't have all the details or you haven't done the actual primary source research does not give you the default right to question things that you don't understand as utterly false. And that goes for any subject. I think if you're going to approach something like this, you really have to approach it from understanding source material, understanding what liberties can be taken with translation, and really avoiding this, well, it couldn't have happened that way because I didn't learn that in fill in the blank, academia, school, my household growing up. And I think a big part of this book was kind of easing people into the idea and kind of deprogramming them from this knee-jerk reaction. when you hear Atlantis or you hear Lemuria or you hear any of these kind of new age, and I don't like to use that because Plato's not a new age person. And this is something that, evolved this story over thousands of years. And I think it's incredibly important to really look at the details.
You mentioned another key thing, which is the location of Atlantis according to Plato, which was of course beyond the Pillars of Hercules, which is the modern Gibraltar. And we know that from other sources that what was that Greeks called Hercules Pillars was actually the Strait of Gibraltar, and Plato mentioned that it was beyond it or in front of it, depending on the translation.
That's
which shows us that it was beyond the Mediterranean. And even as you mentioned, Plato says even more about it, that there is something beyond what we call the ocean, and that there is some land that is surrounding this huge body of water, which when we actually switch the map and we look from the perspective, if we were sailing, for example, from the Straits of Gibraltar beyond to the Atlantic Ocean, which is also the same name as Atlantis, we've got Atlantic Ocean, Atlas Mountains in the north of Africa, and we see that the Americas, both Americas, North and South, with of course the Middle Americas, actually show us a continent that surrounds the Atlantic Ocean. We've got only places to leave this ocean at the north and at the south. So this is a very interesting detail which can show us that Plato had knowledge beyond the knowledge of what we know Greeks knew about the geography of the world, because the Greeks were actually limited. We know a few maps which show their worldview about how the world looked like. They knew about, of course, only the south of Europe, north of Africa, and a bit of Asia, and this was their world. And Plato here in his two dialogues show us that there is something beyond, which is also an interesting point against the skeptics who say, oh, Plato's story of Atlantis was a story, for instance, of the eruption of the Terra volcano on the Mediterranean Sea. But Plato uses completely different language. He isn't saying that it is on the Mediterranean Sea, but he says that it is beyond the Mediterranean, on the ocean.
This is
Oceanos.
Oceanos, exactly. And he even says, to contradistinguish the Mediterranean from the Atlantic, he says our sea is but like an inland sea. It's like a lake. It's like a large lake, So he was absolutely aware of the physical boundaries of the Mediterranean. And then beyond the Straits of Gibraltar, the true ocean can be reached, wherein lies Atlantis, and beyond it, a continent that surrounds the true sea. So again, what you just said is so important. How did a Greek philosopher living in Athens in 360 BC know about North America? How? How did he know that? I include a really funny interview where a Washington Post, I think, reporter in the 80s went to the Azores just to do a tourist, like a Frommer's guide for which bars and things to go to. And he said in the cab driver in the Azores, he brought this up. And the guy said to him, well, I pre-internet, he said, well, I don't know anything about Atlantis. And he says, you're on the mountain peaks of Atlantis. And he pulled out the dialogues of Plato and he says, look, how did Plato know about America? And the guy says, wait, Plato knew about America? I never read that, and I don't think a lot of people know this, and I think it's important because it's not that Plato
knew or had direct knowledge of North America. It's that Solon was in touch with the Egyptians, who I would argue are a remnant colony of Atlantis, and they preserved that knowledge, and later there's a lot of evidence that the Phoenicians, thousands of years before Columbus, had actually reached parts of, say, Brazil, and possibly even North America. And how did they have these maps and this knowledge of the true ocean? Well, probably because they themselves were a remnant colony, maritime civilization that had preserved either physical maps, like the Piri Reis map or its source map, perhaps, or direct knowledge. of this. And so these are incredibly difficult things to explain if, again, you're writing a foundational myth or some sort of allegory. I think a lot of times people think, well, Plato wrote the allegory of the caves. And yeah, well, it's called the allegory of the cave, and it's disclaimed as an allegory. And I think it's really kind of unfortunate that Atlantis has been wrapped up as this, allegory or a even, myth, when in fact Plato was describing, sixth hand, but to the best of his ability, itself a fragment of a much bigger story that Plato's story itself was just but the ending of. And so I think what's so exciting about this show, and what we'll get to a chance to do, is, go all the way back, using remote viewing, using kind of deduction, using pre-Platonic sources, and seeing how they align to show, well, how did the civilization even emerge? And how did it get to the point of this final destruction that Plato himself described?
Yes, you mentioned another key factor, because you mentioned, Atlantis was some kind of a relatively large island, and many people say, there couldn't be such an island because something. But actually, and it is a geological fact, not a crazy conspiracy theory, that from the time of the ending of the last ice age, like from about 13,000 years ago up until now, the sea levels rose about 120 meters, which is 120 meters. So imagine right now you are on a beach nearby you, and now you can see 120 meters, which is like a large, I don't know how many stories building, but a large building. And this was the rise in the sea levels from the time, of course, of the last ice age, which is 13,000 years ago. But actually, we know, geological speaking, that at some point it was faster, then it slowed down, but it is still a huge difference from the sea levels of nowadays. And another key thing is that averaged, when it comes to the entire Earth, there sank about 25 million square kilometers, which is more than the area of an entire North America. Not the United States, but an entire North America, and it is more than that. I think that North America is between 19 and 21 million square kilometers, and here we are talking about 25 million square kilometers. We can also compare it to like almost all the Asia, like from India to China, which is a huge mass of land. So if all that land sank from that time, I think that there is a space for, as you mentioned, an island either of a size of modern Spain without Portugal, or maybe a little bit smaller island, who knows. But I think that for sure there is a space for the existence of such an island, which is a key detail. And another detail that is connected with that is that Plato, at some point in his dialogues, tells us that still outside the Pillars of Hercules there are remnants of Atlantis, because the sea there where Atlantis existed is really muddy and it is not navigable, so you cannot sail through it. So even at times of Plato, more than 2000 years ago, there were still remnants, maybe, as you mentioned, the peaks of the Atlantis in the Azores. So if the sea level rose 120 meters, we can see, even if the civilization or the city, the main capital of Atlantis, was a, let's say, advanced city like about ancient Rome and ancient Greece at least, it could have sunk, and now we can have no traces of it. So it is another key detail. And I think that in the next episodes we'll go through many other, as you mentioned, points in the story of Atlantis, because it is a big picture which has so many points, so many correlations, so many ideas that we can find in geology or in historical sources, that we will have on this channel an entire series about the lost civilization of Atlantis. But at the end, before you can add something also to the end, I wanted to mention another thing that we only mentioned briefly, that it wasn't Plato who invented the story of Atlantis, but Plato in his two dialogues says that it was Solon during his voyages to Egypt found at a local temple in Sais, which is a real place in ancient Egypt, one of the oldest cities in this area. He went to Egypt, to this city of Sais, and there at a temple some priests told Solon that, oh, you Greeks are only children because your history is going back only a few hundred or even a few thousand years back, but the Egyptian history goes much further back. And it was in this temple in the city of Sais that Solon found or heard the story of Atlantis. And I think that in the second episode we'll go into this story, we'll dive deeper into what Solon heard from these Egyptians and how it can be correlated to real sources from ancient Egypt that are similar to the stories of Atlantis. And we'll go into the idea that the story of Atlantis is much older than Plato's Timaeus and Critias dialogues.
Absolutely. I think that's really important what you said, that the origin of the Atlantis story is Egypt, or the same region where, other incredible mysteries abound. The Giza pyramid complex, to name the biggest, which I would argue later we can talk about how that is related and how that was an Atlantean legacy, not a pharaonic Egyptian creation, which would explain its absolutely impossible megalithic construction and qualities and just the total mystery surrounding it, that we're looking, actually, when we look at the Great Pyramid of Giza, we're looking at perhaps one of the few above sea level existing megalithic structures built by survivors of this culture. I would argue before the Cataclysm it was built. And I can explain why in another episode. I would put the date of that project around 10,500 BC. But I think it's important to remember that Plato gives a very clear chain of custody to the story, from himself down through about 3 people to Solon, who himself was, who died before he could finish the story according to sources. And Solon himself credits the temple priest at Sais in Egypt. So I always say, when people say later on, why are people suggesting that the pyramids have anything to do with Atlantis? I say, well, Plato himself says the story of Atlantis comes from Egypt. That's not a New Age concept. That's not something, Graham Hancock invented or something. This is a primary source, one of the most reputable in, I would say, the Western catalog, who says the story of Atlantis comes from Egypt. And what's incredible, Alex, is just this year, a colleague of mine, Manu Saifzadeh, who he's one of the few people that can decipher many of these hieroglyphics on the temples. While he was there, he would argue that the story of Atlantis, actually, if you decrypt certain glyphs from the Temple of Edfu, is inscribed
on the wall. And it was described as the place of the first waters, or the island of the egg, which is incredible. So there's still, depending on how you interpret some of these things, evidence in Egypt of the Atlantean legacy. And so, to me, what I think is so important is that rather than being the kind of weird exception to this very cookie cutter, totally incomplete view of history that most professional historians have and most lay people have, which is what you said, the hunter-gatherers and then the Fertile Crescent, and then, here we are in 2025. Actually, Atlantis is the keystone to ancient history. Quite the contrary. That this, I would say, colonial or imperial nation, which itself had gone through numerous iterations, but the one Plato is describing for the sake of this conversation, this imperial island-based civilization, which in his account, goes on a invasion of the Mediterranean at the end of its, tenure as this, supreme colonial power. and is defeated by the Athenians, and then the Cataclysm happens. That's his order of the final, stage of events. But if you look at it geographically, it's so many things that make no sense that we really, as historians, have to double, bend over backwards to explain. Linguistic similarity, etymological, just total anomalies in, say, for example, why, are people who speak the Basque language able to communicate with certain indigenous people in Central America who speak, Yucatec and Maya? If we're to believe the traditional story that, 1492, Columbus sailed the ocean blue, or whatever the rhyme is, that is so, it's so statistically impossible that we find temple complexes in Mexico that are identical nearly in configuration to ones in Egypt. If these cultures had not been linked by their parent culture, which we can call Atlantis, or numerous other, iterations of this group of people who lived in the mid-Atlantic, who were able to traverse it and actually leave traces of their culture linguistically, architecturally, in places that we believe after the Cataclysm as being inheritors of this, enormous gap of ocean that now covers, thousands of miles that separate Europe from North America. That's our reality. And that's so ingrained in us that I always tell people, go to my website, michaeliflem.com, and one of the graphics is a map from the 60s from an Oceanographic Institute of the Atlantic Ocean drain. And this is such a viscerally important image to get in your mind, because we think of it from maps as just empty space. But if you drain the water from the Atlantic Ocean, what do you see? An enormous island landmass, exactly where Plato said that's the peak of the mid-Atlantic ridge, which itself, much of it was above water before this cataclysm. And we know this because the people that discovered it in 1877, when these professional oceanographers came back to London after the Challenger expedition, sailing ship, steamship, when they came back to London, do you know what the first thing they did was? They gave a conference. These are mainstream oceanographers. They gave a conference, then they wrote an article that was published in Scientific American. And do you know what the name of the article was? Glimpses of Atlantis. And what do they say? They say all these numerous ancient sources are now starting to coalesce with what we just discovered, which is what Plato said. Plato said that there was an island landmass off the Straits of Gibraltar that was destroyed. And lo and behold, as we are mapping the ocean floors in 1877, we discovered a landmass which lends credibility. And these were mainstream oceanographers. And so I always want to tell people that it's actually only quite a small but very loud subset of people who categorically deny this. In fact, as I show throughout my book, the enormous preponderance of serious thinkers throughout Western history have taken this subject extremely serious. Plato, Montaigne, Isaac, Bacon even talked about it. You've got mainstream oceanographers in the 19th century who discovered the mid-Atlantic ridge, who couldn't explain how Plato was aware of that. Things like this. And then really the shocking information comes much later when, we can show what certain remote viewers have discovered, which they could not have known until later geology confirmed that with satellite imagery and bathythermic scans of the ocean floor. So I think it's, as a foundational story, it is a true story. Now, how much of it is exactly as Plato described in his quite short dialogues? Well, as much as, say, the story of Aleksander and his speeches is true. because we have no primary accounts of anything Alexander said, believe it or not. So I always tell people this, anytime you see a movie and it purports to show, the configuration of Darius's army at the Battle of Gaugamela, well, these are based on sources much further removed, from Alexander's time, from a different culture, from ancient Rome. We don't have anything that Alexander wrote. We don't have anything that Jesus wrote. We don't have anything that Socrates wrote. We have to take Plato's word that he was a real person, and, the handful of other playwrights that claim he was a real person. So I always tell people, be very careful when it comes to just, we teach Socrates as if he were a real person, and yet we have nothing he wrote. We speak of him with total authority, but everything we know about Socrates comes from the same person who gave us Atlantis. And I think that's extremely important to remember, is that we play hard and fast with what we like. But the second a story comes in that challenges perhaps the timeline, not dramatically, but just pushes it back, say, 6,000 years beyond the acceptable bounds of civilization, it's suddenly to be thrown out into the dustbin, which I think is terribly immature. And also, to have the intellectual curiosity to approach a subject like this actually is quite rewarding, because it unlocks so many other things that even myself, 10 years ago, before I started investigating this professionally, made no sense to me. Even as a person who grew up in the Atlantic Ocean, on Atlantic Boulevard as a young kid in Florida, this name has no etymology that we can easily trace to ancient Greece or really anything. And yet you see that tla sound in places like the Tlaxcala people in Mexico, or the myth of Aztlan that the Aztecs had, and their god, Atlanteotl, who looks just like the Greek god Atlas. And it's like, well, how are these statistically possible? Coincidences? They're not. They're an ancient legacy that we totally disregarded. And so it's great to actually go through that systematically with you and unpack piece by piece another layer of the mystery.
We'll go through all those topics that you mentioned in other episode. I think the next one will be about the historical validity of Plato Atlantis. We'll go through the sources. We'll go through the validity of Solon's journeys. We'll analyze some ancient Egyptian sources, but you mentioned plenty of other things, so it will be a very, very long series. Therefore,
1,000
don't
episodes.
Don't forget to subscribe to our channels, and below in the description of this video you will have the links to our books, of course, Michael's Left Lambs, Visions of Atlantis, and mine, Déjà Vu Has Everything Already Been, which we highly recommend you to read, because in those books we go beyond the topic of Atlantis and we analyze much more of our forgotten history. So that would be all for the first episode on our new channel, and stay tuned for the other.
Thank you.